Well, welcome. Thank you for celebrating with us this morning. I'm excited to be here. I'm a little bit nervous, so bear with me. I'm still the new guy around here, so that's. I'm working on it. I'm working on it. Okay, well, it only gets worse from here. Thank you. My name is Jason Pridmore. I'm the new youth and family minister here. We've been here a short month already and have been received and welcomed so kindly by you all and my family included. And I'm sorry if I haven't got a chance to meet you yet. I'm looking forward to getting to know all of you at some point or another. And Pastor thought it would be a good idea if maybe for those of you who don't know me and many of you don't know my story, if I shared with you my story this morning. And so that's what I'm going to do if you'll humor me. I feel like I've always been a Christian, and I don't know if that's the same. If some of you guys have that same feeling, I was basically born into the church. My dad was a youth pastor, a wonderful youth pastor, and later became a senior pastor, and now is retired and still working full time in a church. And my mom has always been doing something in the church. She's led countless Bible studies and Sunday school classes for both adults and youth, and they've just always, my entire life, they've been so fully engrossed with the church, and it's nice to see even now they're still fully active, working full time in the ministry in the Philippines. And so even before I could walk, I remember I was thrown into youth group. I was part of church activities and functions. I was part of every play and every musical our church put on. I was in the handbell choir. I didn't tell the last service that because all the kids are there and I'm still trying to keep some street cred. But I did handbells. I loved it. That's no knock there. I love the handbells. And I was in children's choirs and every summer did VBS and mission trips and just anything that was going on I plugged into and I was a part of because I was at the church so much. I literally grew up inside a church. And so it's been a huge part of my life, and it's important. Its importance was never lost on me. My mom had a rule that said that we could miss a day of school for just about any reason, and I could come up with a whole bunch of different ones, and I got pretty good at faking stomach aches, and I missed a lot of school, but we couldn't miss. We were not allowed to miss church. There was not a reason that would allow her or allow us to miss a Sunday morning. And I'm not saying that that's the best parenting policy, but I will tell you, growing up, I always knew what was most important and who was most important in our household. And so it was kind of a nice thing, and I really appreciate that about my parents. But at the age of 12, they encouraged me to no longer depend on their faith. They said, you can't depend on our faith. You've got to get out and really start growing in your own faith. And so one summer evening in Angel Stadium, down on the field, it's our baseball field back home in California, at the Billy Graham Crusade, I became very serious and very intentional about my relationship with Jesus, and went down there and committed my life to Him right there on first base. And how fitting of a place to start, right? First base with the Lord. And I'll tell you, ever since then, I've been struggling to keep my eyes on Him. And I've been trying to follow Him as closely as I know how. And that's my story. I didn't say it was a good story, but that's what I've got. That's what I've been given. The earlier service, somebody suggested maybe the comment saying, that's probably a good place to stop right there. And you may wish that I did that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to continue. My story is I hope it's not like yours. I find mine to be mundane and kind of plain. It's uneventful. It's unmoving. There's no before after. There's not a huge transformation. There's not a dramatic episode in my life. It's what it is. I grew up in the church, and I've always felt that I was close to the Lord, or at least following. When Pastor Dave asked me to share my testimony this morning, it drudged up some some anxiety inside of me, some nervousness, some old feelings I felt the first time I was asked to share my testimony. At age 13, my parents moved us to the Philippines. And at age 17, I was part of a short-term missions team there. We were doing some relief work for people displaced by the eruption of the volcano Mount Pinatubo there. And while working among this, we were working in this massive tent city. The lead missionary asked if I would stand up in front of hundreds of people and share my testimony. And I was terrified. I'd never done it before. I wasn't quite sure what to say. I'd seen it done before, but I was really kind of scared about doing it. But at the same time, something inside me crept in, and I had this eagerness about it. I really wanted to. I wanted to get up there. I wanted to stand up there. I was a young Christian, and here's this opportunity, I thought, to win some converts for the kingdom, and that was going to happen through my story, and I really had that in my heart. I wanted so badly my story, my testimony, to have an impact that morning, and I stood up there, and I began to tell my story, and I looked out over the crowd of people, and here these folks are, this forlorn and distressed people, people who had lost everything, had lost their homes and their belongings. Some of them had lost family members and loved ones. And my own home life crept in. And I thought, well, here I am, this American, a foreigner in their land. I'm really a benefactor of white privilege, as they say. Growing up in the Philippines, we kind of lived life in the lap of luxury. We had a driver and we had 2 live-in maids. It was really nice. And I stood before these people with that in the back of my head, and my heart went out to these folks as their lives were just crumbled and broken. And in that moment, with every good intention, I did what I felt like any great evangelical would have done in my shoes. And I began to lie. We're in church, so I'm going to confess. I made up my testimony. My story was the same then as the one I just shared with you. There wasn't a whole lot to it. And I knew it wasn't going to be very impactful. It wasn't going to have a whole lot of meaning to these people whose lives have been devastated. And so I stood up there and I told lie after lie, making up these horrific stories of substance abuse and wandering far from God only to come back like the prodigal son. I was telling things that I had no knowledge of. I'm pretty sure it showed, and I think I walked right up to the edge. I fell short. I didn't talk about talking donkeys, and I left out demon possession and suicidal pigs like the story we heard this morning. But if you were last week, I don't know if he did it last week at the 9:30. The gentleman from the Gideons shared a story of a man being converted, a young man being converted after he smoked a Bible that was given to him by the Gideons. And I thought, oh my gosh, what a great story of conversion. I wish I had that one then. I would have borrowed from that and used that. And there are so many great conversion stories out there, and mine simply wasn't one of them. So I stood up there making these things up, hoping that my words and these stories would have an impact on these people. I've got to ask, usually not too many people, but have you ever told a really great story that you've heard that happened to somebody else, only you tell it as if it happened to you? Is there anyone that's done that? Thank you. I know I can't be the only one, but this may put me into a. Do we have to? It's always the pastors, you know them, that's for sure. And this may put me in a separate category, but I'm going to ask anyway. Have you ever been telling that story as if it happened to you and realized mid-story that you were telling the story to the person it actually happened to? Who does that? Who does that? That's craziness. That's what I did. I stood up there on this podium and was sharing these stories. And at one point, I made eye contact with my best friend who was along on this trip. And at that point, I realized that part of the story I was telling now was actually his testimony. And he was getting ready to get up and tell it right behind me. And I've got to say, it was more than an awkward situation. He knew the stories I were telling wasn't true, and let alone for it to be his story. It was pathetic. It was embarrassing. But I wonder how many of us are kind of like that same way. And I don't mean how many of us go around passing off other people's stories as our own. What I mean is, how many of us are hesitant to share our story, to tell our faith story, either because we don't know what to say or even how to say it, or if you're like me, maybe you think your story just, golly, there's just nothing to it. There may be other reasons that prevent you from sharing or create hesitation in your life. I recently read a survey that the number one reason people don't go to church is because they're afraid of being judged by the people there. And I think that's a horrible thing that we as Christians, we need to do a better job at correcting and fixing that generality. That's a terrible thing for us to be known as. And in that same survey, though, they asked Christians what the number one reason was why they didn't share their story more. And it was because they were afraid of being judged by the people they were talking to. This is kind of a good thing. I think it puts a commonality between us all. We're all in that same boat. It's level playing field. We're all afraid of being judged and being ridiculed and made fun of. And I know as a young man, I was in that same boat. And to some degree, I'm feeling that a little bit today. But that's what I'm so excited about, this Daring Faith campaign that's going on next week. It is a great opportunity, not just for us to bond in small groups and fellowship. And I asked this in the earlier ones, how many of you guys are connected, just by a show of hands, connected to a small group that's part of that Daring Faith campaign? Okay. Well, look around at your neighbors and the folks who don't have their hands up. Please, we want to publicly shame you. This is a great opportunity for us as a church, from all the different services, church-wide campaign, that we can all be connected and doing the same thing. And in addition, the small groups is going to create such fellowship and bonding that perhaps we haven't seen here in a long time. And more importantly, I think, what this new study is going to do is it's going to challenge us to really live out our faith in a bold new way that perhaps we haven't done. And it may even help us build the confidence to get out and tell our stories and give us those words and those moments. And so if you haven't been encouraged enough, there is that board in the back. It's another shameless plug here. Find a date. We've got nights and groups at all times, at all places, all over the county here. Please find a place to plug in. We want you there. We don't want you to miss out on this. But in the meantime, I'll be happy to share some of the things that made it easier for me to tell my story. At least without fabricating most of it. The first thing that I found that was helpful was realizing that my story wasn't really my story. My story is actually a subtext. It's a minor role of a larger, much greater story. And for me, early on, that was a difficult concept to grasp. I think in all of us, and to some degree, maybe for some more than others, but all of us are in some way a bit egocentric, in that we kind of want to be at the center of things, don't we? We want to be at the center of parties or the action or attention, and really, maybe more specifically, we want to be the center of our own lives, don't we? We think, well, it's our life, it's our experiences, our choices, this is our story, it's our life. And what I'm finding more as I go along and slowly, I'm thinking, well, that's not really the case at all. I don't think it is our life. I don't think so. I mean, we're all part of the story, that's for sure, but I don't believe that story starts with us. Jeremiah 1:5, the Lord says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart." What a wonderful, wonderful verse here. And it tells us our stories don't begin with us, but they begin and are founded in Him. Way before we ever were. But what God does, and this is a beautiful thing, what He does is He intertwines our life with His, which gives the story kind of a personal a personal touch. We're able to tell his story with our own experiences, the way we've experienced him, our own perspectives, how we've seen him and have touched him and how he's been involved with our lives. And it's by telling these stories that gives that personal relation to other people. It allows people to relate to the personal side of those stories, which ultimately they're able to relate to God's story. And I think that's a beautiful thing. Understanding that it wasn't my story, that it's not my story, it's God's story, took a lot of the fears out of my life, at least in these situations, in moments where I could share my testimony. There was no longer any pressure on me. I didn't feel the pressure of feeling like I had to make a change in somebody's life, that I had to impact them in a positive way or in any way. But what I found out is if it's God's story, he can do what he wants. He can use it to impact people or not. I just have to tell it. That's the easy part. I can tell that part. I don't have to feel like I've got to add to it or make up things to make it more impactful or more powerful. Because really, what's more powerful than a story about the creator of the universe? I don't think anything. And the beautiful side of that is he includes us. He lets us be part of that story. And I love that. And for me, it takes off that pressure. And you'll get to know me, and maybe, Darlene, you'll get to know me a little bit better than some of you. But I love passing on my assumed responsibilities to somebody else. I do. If I can delegate, I am happy about that. My wife thinks I'm lazy about it, but I also think she thinks I found a spiritual loophole, because scripturally, God tells us we're supposed to do that. We're supposed to pass our things on to him. And when we think about that, when you think about passing on and giving ownership to, I'm talking about our relationships, our marriages, our money, our jobs, our health, all of these things that we assume are ours. When we give them to God, we don't have to worry about them. They're his. He can do whatever he wants with. And we know and we can trust. We know and we can trust that God will do what's best for us, what goes according to his will, which is, we know, is perfect. The spiritual loophole that my wife thinks I've found is supported. And I've got some scripture. I'm going to share that. I'm not making this stuff up. Psalm 55:22 says, "Cast your burden upon the Lord, and he will sustain you." 1 Peter 5:7 says, "Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all of your anxiety on him, because he cares for you." And even Jesus in Matthew 12:28, he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." When our things become his things, we don't have to worry about them anymore. He's going to take care of them in his way. And I know that's a tough thing to do. It's a tough thing to do, to surrender that control. But for me, acknowledging that my story is not my story, but really it's his story, for me it made things easier sharing it without having that pressure. The other thing that helped me in my ability to tell my story and make things a little bit easier was understanding the transformative aspect in the story. I had always thought that the more dramatic a shift from one lifestyle to another, the more powerful a story was. And I was led into that thinking, and that's why I felt the need to make up my story that first time I was sharing my testimony. And I know many of us, we carry our background, we carry our stories as kind of a badge of honor, if you will. And I'm not trying to take that away from anyone. They're valid experience and valid stories. I've seen a negative side to it, because I think sometimes people use these stories as one-uppers, if you will. They use them to outdo each other, to say things like, God's grace was greater with the greater sinner, and they build up these stories. And I think it's a misguided thinking that the greater the story and the adventure and the drama, the greater the conversion. And I just disagree with that. I think it builds into the psyche, it built into my psyche and maybe other people, where our story isn't as dramatic, then maybe it's not worth telling. And I believe that for a long time, and that's not the case. That's not the case. I think too many people put too much emphasis on who they were before being saved. Too many people think that their stories start with who they are, and I'm finding more and more that I don't think it matters who we were to start off. 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, "If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come." And so whether it was a life of faith or a life of filth, you have been saved from whatever you were before. You've been saved from everything that you were before knowing Jesus. And the old is gone. The old is it's non-specific. It's not relevant to what Christ has done, to what Christ is doing and will continue to do in your life. The old is gone. Our beginnings, who we are, is basically a backdrop or a prelude to the real story. And that story is of a God who, through His love, changes us from whatever we were before into these beautifully imperfect creatures who resemble His image more and more as He works in and through us daily. Our stories are merely the vessels, the platforms to presenting God's story. And I guess that's what I'm trying to say here this morning is that it's been helpful to me. I hope it's helpful for you. I don't know if it is. It's been helpful to me in sharing my story, knowing that it isn't really how far I've come. My story does not have to be dramatic in any way, at least in my own doing. Doesn't matter about how my actions measure up to any of the critics that might be listening. It isn't about me at all, in fact, and that's a huge thing to understand. But knowing that it's what God does in our lives, that transformation that He does for anyone who comes to Him, in all of us, that makes it easier, that I can talk about what God is doing, what He's done, what He's doing in my life. Puts the pressure on Him. And I like that. And that's kind of what this passage, this passage out of Mark is really about. It sets us up with an example of how to tell the story, and maybe more importantly, the encouragement. It shows us why we should tell the story. Now, the story that we heard about this man living amongst the tombs, demon-possessed, is a wonderfully graphic story. If you can drop the visuals, I'm a visual learner. I love the story just as I can just picture it. It's a scary story, kind of, as you think of this demon-possessed man amongst the tombs, and maybe it's a perfect story for the Halloween season, but it's also this wonderfully dramatic conversion story of this man who was probably the furthest you could be from Jesus, from God. And in a mere encounter with Him, his life was completely transformed. And the story is wonderful. It's a great dramatic story of this man who was and wanted to be as far away from Jesus, who was afraid of Jesus when he saw Him, but in that moment, in that encounter, something changed. Jesus changed his life. And you see this transformation that happens to where he didn't want to be anywhere near Him, to where he was sitting at His feet and begging to be with Him, to go with Him, to follow Him, to spend just a few more minutes with Him. It's that transformation. It's not so much about where he came from, but what we hear in the story in verse 19 is Jesus' response to this man, and He says, "Go and tell your family how much the Lord has done for you and how He has had mercy on you." He doesn't say, "Go and remind everybody about what a crazy nut you used to be," or how far you've transformed, reminding people where you were and look where you are today. No, I think Jesus really, really kind of hits this one on the head. He puts the emphasis where I think it needs to be. He says, "Go and tell the story of when you met Jesus, and tell people what He did for you and in your life." And I think that's the model for us, that we should go and tell others what God has done and what He's doing in our life. That's great. That's easy. And we see what happens when we tell the story. In the story from Mark, as this man went out, he went out to the Decapolis, the 10 cities that were gathered, this large area of people. And he's sharing this story with people who 4 and 5 verses earlier were afraid, who had seen what had happened, and they became terrified to the point where they wanted Jesus out of the territory. They wanted Him away. They wanted nothing to do with Jesus. Until this man started telling his story about what Jesus had done in his life. And it ends with that verse, and the people were amazed. They went from being afraid to hearing the story to becoming amazed. And I think that's the key. The power of the story is in the telling of the story, but we have to tell the story. We have to get out and we have to tell the story. And that's what he's telling us here today. He's telling us today that it's simple. It's simple. Take the pressure off yourself. It doesn't have to be about you. It's not about you anyway. But go out and tell others what God is doing in your life. It is absolutely, without a doubt, the greatest gift that we could give anyone is an introduction to Jesus. We don't have to transform their life. We don't have to change their life. But an introduction to Jesus, a mere encounter with Jesus, we've seen it time and time again. That's powerful. Jesus will handle it and take it from there. And so as you're sitting here this morning, I'm going to wrap things up. I want you to be thinking a little bit. Have you been telling your story? Have you ever told your story? Are you looking for those opportunities that may arise outside of church to share your story? I hope you are. But maybe more importantly than that, instead of waiting for those opportunities to arise, are you out creating those opportunities to share your story and what God has done in your life? I don't know where you're at right now. I don't know if you feel any better about your story. I think about my story. I was thinking about it all week, and it doesn't get good. It doesn't get better. It's just a boring story. I'm sorry. But I found this verse that I feel that just really helps. Again, reminding myself, remembering that it's not about me. This, and you can have this. This is Philippians 2, verses 6 through 8. Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And that's the God that we're talking about. The God who calls us into relationship, who calls us into community with himself. It's the God who desires us so much that he left the comfort of heaven. He walked across the cosmos. He walked across the universe. And he emptied himself out so that he might come to us in human form as Jesus. And in a form that we could understand, and maybe more importantly, that we could come to know. It's a God whose love for us is so great that he puts his Son on that cross daily for the sins that we all commit. But that through him and in him, we might find not only peace and joy and comfort and fulfillment, but a life everlasting. And that same God, that Jesus, through his Holy Spirit, is constantly at work in our lives, leading and guiding us to that end on a daily basis, transforming us from the wretched, sinful creatures that we are into his children, into his people, into his beloved, purified and sanctified in and through him. And now that's, when you think about it that way, that's a story worth telling. And that's my story. And it's your story. Together, it's our story. And ultimately, when told, it tells the story of God. So I want to encourage you this morning to go out and tell your story. I want you to encourage you to tell it often and understand. It's through the telling of our story that others are coming to know Jesus, they're being introduced to Jesus, and it's through that moment that he utilizes that to transform their lives. Amen.